or any background involving the Vietnam War, and just tell
Yeah,
us briefly.
I'll just start with my as a young boy when my brother served 2 tours in Vietnam, 1969 and again in 1970-71, and I was about 10 or 11 years old during that time, and so I have memories of him being there and then what was going on in this country while he was serving, and how frightened my parents were and how attentive we were to watching the news every night. And then he came back. He was very much affected by the war, although we didn't know it at the time, as most families didn't really know. But slowly, his life kind of unraveled, and so he's very severely affected. He has PTSD. He has Agent Orange related leukemia. So he's been severely, and he's a disabled vet, so, like so many others.
So you said your brother was in the war. What was his job title? What was his rank? And then what kind of action did he see?
He was and I got a picture of him here if you guys want. This was him in 1971, just before he got out. You can tell because of the long hair and everything. You guys want to look at that? But he was a mobile radio operator in the Air Force. And he worked with the infantry. He was out in the field, so he was at one point as close to, I think, 10, 15 miles from the DMZ, which is the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam during the war. So he saw a lot of stuff happen. He wasn't out in the in the jungle or whatever with an M16, but he was in his Jeep or in his radio tent, communicating with the pilots, and he remembers a lot of, working with the Koreans. He worked with the South Korean Army. He also worked with the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army. And he had some close calls, and he did see a lot of carnage and terrible things happen to people.
So I mean, he never, it's kind of taboo to ask, but he never really shot anybody or killed anybody, or...
No, because that wasn't his job, but he worked with the folks who did. And he does remember taking, whenever he was on the radio, he would hear Mayday calls, so that's kind of haunting to him. He still hears those voices of the pilots going down, usually helicopter pilots, because he could always tell, because they're, you could hear the rotors in the background and the warbling of the voice. And he said that was pretty terrible. And then he remembers during one particular operation in 1971 called Lam Son 719, ARVN soldiers, South Vietnamese soldiers, were being rescued by American pilots, and as they were coming back, they were flying in, and there was too many of them, so some of them were hanging on the skids of the helicopter, and they couldn't hang on anymore, and they were dropping into their death. He said that was horrible. Because he has images like that.
And then, I guess you guys have anything right now? Kind of drawing a blank. So, I guess we go. How was the relationship with your brother before, during, and after it was all said and done?
That's a good question. Before, it was typical. He's 9 years older than me, so it was a typical big brother, little brother. I wanted to follow in his footsteps, do everything he did, and he, trying to get rid of me because he wanted to be with his friends and do whatever they were going to do as teenagers. So, but it was pretty normal. I'd say I kind of looked like, we were kind of like, if you ever seen the old Leave It to Beaver show, I was kind of like Beaver, and he was Wally. That's kind of the way it was. Then when he came back from Vietnam, it was different. In fact, I remember the first day that he came back, he locked himself in his room, and I kept knocking on the door, and he told me to go away, and he didn't want to talk to me, he didn't want to talk to Mom, and that was very unusual for him not to want to talk to Mom, because they were very close. And he was withdrawn, and the only person he would talk to is his friends who had been in Vietnam that came to visit, and they went into his room and they just were in there smoking and talking, and so he was very withdrawn when he came in. So I knew that there was something, but we didn't quite understand the full extent of it. But as the years unfolded, things got worse for him. He got into drugs and drinking, and went through a couple of marriages, and so he had a tough time.
So I remember I actually bought your book, by the way, and I started reading it. You outlined some of his letters and saying you could tell slowly that he was changing, right? That progressively he was changing, how the war was affecting him.
Yeah, I could tell, and he also tried to hide the fact that he was in Vietnam. So he grew his hair long, and when people asked him, he never said anything. Only around other vets would he admit he was a veteran, and a lot of that was just because none of them were really accepted when they came back. They weren't accepted by society in general because we ended up losing the war, and it was an unpopular war, and also he wasn't accepted by the World War II generation because they figured it wasn't a real war, and especially when the war didn't go the way they planned, they blamed, a lot of people blamed the veterans for that, which was unfair. So that's what I noticed mainly, is him kind of hiding out, and a lot of his friends hiding out, and then I started noticing like anger outbursts and things like that that were unusual for him because he was more of a happy-go-lucky kind of person.
How did the transition go from after he left back to regular old civilian? How was that transition?
Well, he was going to go to college before he went to Vietnam. When he came back, he abandoned all those ideas. I think he had trouble concentrating. So he went into carpentry like my father. My dad was a carpenter. And and he did fairly well in commercial carpentry. So that's what he did. And he seemed to be okay, in terms of his work. It was his personal life and family life that was suffering. Although he did have kids and all that. Eventually his drug and alcohol problems caught up with him.
Okay, I guess we've seen in our class, we've seen a couple movies about, Vietnam War, there's still a couple more we're going to see. Is there any movie character in particular you want to maybe compare him to, or are you seeing similarities or resemblance?
I don't know if there's any particular character. I mean, he was a young, naive, not soldier, but airman, I guess they call him in the Air Force, but kind of like in Platoon when Chris Taylor first comes to Vietnam, he's very naive. So my brother, he had the crisp uniform, the high and tight haircut, everything, and then you can see this before he left, and he was wearing the John Lennon sunglasses and the peace symbol and the long hair. So he transformed, and he was actually, like other guys at that time, were protesting against the war while they were fighting the war in Vietnam. They did it silently, but they still, like the letters home that he wrote were different. They had peace symbols at the bottom of them. He started to question why we were here. He was telling us that there were things going on that we weren't reading about in the newspapers back home that we would be shocked about, if we knew.
Would you mind telling us some of those things? I mean, if...
well, like, us going into Laos and Cambodia, those are things that weren't at first known, and then later were revealed, and that increased the protesting. So he was referring to things like that. I think he was also referring to how we treated the Vietnamese as well, how we treated the South Vietnamese, which was not in a good way. Just put it that way. Towards the end of the war, people were so bitter. The Americans were bitter. I think the South Vietnamese, many of them fighting, didn't trust the Americans. The Americans didn't trust the South Vietnamese. And how can you fight together if you don't trust each other? And that was the big problem. And especially that operation I mentioned earlier, Lam Son 719. It's an example of how the Americans didn't trust the South Vietnamese, so they didn't give them the intelligence information that they needed to conduct the operation. And then the South Vietnamese regime was corrupt, and the generals were fighting, so there was corruption and infighting going on. So the result, of course, is that the communists prevailed. And so I think it kind of explains what went wrong. And I mean, there's a lot of complex factors, but that's I think what he was referring to, and that he had seen a lot of people die, and he was starting to wonder why. Why are the Vietnamese dying? Why are we dying? What's the purpose of this whole thing?